Able to see you all relatively well. So again, thank you for the opportunity. So here I am, finally in Slovenia, first time back in 10 years. Well, it's good to be back. And it's good to get this opportunity to talk to you about some of these ideas around Islamophobia and radicalization, two concepts that get mentioned a lot in various circles, including policy, community, government, media especially. It's a hot topic. But what do these things mean in reality? How do they intersect? And this has been something that's been occupying my mind for the last couple of years. So over the last 2 decades, I've been looking at Islamophobia as this idea of anti-Muslim racism, discrimination, xenophobia, anti-Muslim perspectives which are dominant in media and politics. And then I've been looking at this idea of radicalization, which is violent extremism, conflict, the idea of jihadism, for example. So in looking at these two concepts, I was fascinated to determine essentially what is obvious, which is that they reinforce each other, that they drive each other and sustain each other and mutually empower, if you like, each other's discourses. So I wanted to try and unpack this, and soon enough, the book that I've been working on will be available. The reason why I'm hesitant for a second is because the publisher doesn't like the title, so I have to change the title to something a bit more, something like Wired or Zapped or something like that, in order to appeal to the reading population. I think it's with Hearst. So that's something I've been looking at, and in that analysis, there's been an attempt to try and work out, well, how do these interactions play out? So intersectionality is obviously a very key concept in sociology, and finds place. And the intersectionality of race, gender, ethnicity as a way to try and understand these kind of complex relations in situ, in operation. And so intersectionality in terms of Islamophobia and radicalization is an attempt to try and piece together this perspective. I think about it and I think, well, this is obvious enough, but the problem is the reality doesn't speak in those terms. So if we look at it from the point of view of communities, so let me just give you some background around the communities. We have a community of around 3 million Muslims in Britain. 3 million Muslims is probably seen as a lot, but out of a population of 61 million, it's about 5%. And so there are about 30 million, approximately, Muslim minorities across the Western European space. So France, Germany, Denmark, post-war Muslim groups. Why do we have these Muslim groups? Well, in the post-war period, after the end of the Second World War, there was a need to try and rebuild societies after the collapse, after the conflict had destroyed these spaces. And so Labour was invited. We used the concept of guest workers for the migration into Germany in the late 1960s, early 70s, and also in Denmark. Guest workers, people who would be coming into the country on a temporary basis to work in the industries and the industrial sectors that were least desired by the indigenous populations. So the people of Western Europe wanted better standards of living after the Second World War. They didn't necessarily want to work in factories and heavy engineering sectors. And so they invited people from the once colonized lands. Now this doesn't always apply, say for example in Denmark or in Germany, but certainly in the case of France and in Britain, people who were once colonized were invited to come to work in these factories. There were places, for example, in parts of the Punjab, in Jalandhar, villages where there were London transport signs left to encourage migration to come to London to work in these industries. In the Caribbean, in 1945-46, there was an attempt to try and recruit black nurses into the newly established National Health Service. So it was definitely deliberate, it was state-managed, it was orchestrated, it was designed in order to shore up the labour market sectors in these sort of spaces. So this is the reason why we have a population that started in the late 1940s, chiefly accelerating in the late 50s and 60s and 70s. And then after that, the immigration system decided to halt back on this. Primary migration was impossible. Primary migration is simple. You see a job, or you know of a job, and you catch a plane, you get to the country, you start work, over time you become a citizen. It's impossible to do that now because of various restrictions across the EU framework. And but the problem was, as soon as folks arrived into these parts of part of the country, so if we look over to Britain, anybody here been to Britain, England? Yeah, I guess a few people have. So when we think of British Islam, we think of these 3 million odd Muslims making up 5% of the population, but 95% of those Muslims are in England. England being the major component of Great Britain, United Kingdom. It's not united, it's not a kingdom, but we still use these terms. So when we think of British Islam or British Muslims, it's often English Muslims. And these English Muslims are not spread across the country. If you know the country, it's very much about London and the rest of the country. London being this huge global city with 2,000 plus years of history, the Romans, the Vikings, and so on. And 2/3 of all British Muslims, or rather English Muslims, live in London, but a significant proportion live outside in the Midlands and in the north, where these industrial sectors were once thriving. So engineering, manufacturing, the mills, for example. Britain used to make cars. Used to have cars that people used to buy. Not anymore. BMW and Toyota have factories in Britain making the Mini. The Mini is seemingly an English car, but it's a baby BMW made in Oxford. And we used to do other things as well in terms of manufacturing and industry, but those things have changed in the light of globalization. But specifically focused on the Muslim minority groups who arrived through this migration process, they were ultimately facing problems of industrial decline. So as soon as they came, industries that were working in declined. The car industry, the engineering sectors, for example, motor vehicle sectors that were sort of tangential to these spaces. So what happened was, coming into these spaces in the Midlands and in the North, they found unemployment. And because of de-skilling and low education, they remained unemployed and underemployed, and therefore locked in those inner city spaces in which they first arrived. Because in order to achieve moving out into the nicer areas of the nicer homes, one needs social mobility, one needs an income stream, one needs to be able to get a mortgage and so on. And it's not possible to do that if you haven't got any of these things. So we end up concentrating these Muslim groups, men at first, who were in these towns, and concentrating them in these spaces. And over time, due to patterns of marriage, migration, childbirth, and so on, and within marriage rates, so 99% of Pakistani men will marry Pakistani women 99% of the time. So this is the kind of in-marriage rates you find, and it's less so, for example, among, say, Indians and other groups. And certainly when we think of Caribbeans, African Caribbeans, people who came from the West Indies, which is a colonial term, you're more likely to find African Caribbean in a mixed race, mixed heritage household than not. So you could say that these groups are mixed in or mixed out, depending on how you look at it. Whereas in the case of the South Asian groups, and the South Asian Muslims from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India predominantly, there is much more of an in-mixing, if you like. And that's led to, coupled with economic decline in general, coupled with their labour market, the lack of their labour market space, in the sense that they were unemployed and unemployable, they are found concentrated in those same areas of Birmingham and Bradford, and parts of East London, Tower Hamlets, and parts of West London. And so what happens among the discourse of the right is this view that these Muslims are taking over. They're taking over these cities, that their numbers are multiplying, and that soon we'll be swamped, and we'll have Sharia law, and so on. So this is the discourse of the far right. The English Defence League, and Britain First, which is much more radical, violent, sort of wing of this, and other various groups who are unnamed. For example, Britain First has been proscribed by the state. So the new name for the group is unknown. If you're a certain level of a police officer, you'll know. But these groups tend to reinvent themselves all the time. And we've known over the years that there has been a particular far-right element in British society that has remained in play. Some of you may have watched The Crown, the season on Netflix. You may have seen that King Edward had a link with Hitler. Who were very sympathetic to the ideas of Hitler, and this strain, even the Prince Charles, his father, was Greek, and his sister married Nazis. But that's the complex relationship of European sort of monarchies, if you like, Greek and German and Austrian. So intermarried and somewhat dysfunctional as well. But anyway. So we have this sort of problem of this high visibility of Muslim groups in certain parts of older towns and cities across the country, which has led to different kinds of things going on in those spaces. One of the problems is that because of ongoing issues over the years, so we had race relations in the 60s and 70s. Race was still a concept until 1967, for example, and then it was completely debunked by UNESCO, who confirmed that there are no such thing as races. There's only one race, the human race. And we know, if we go back historically much further, a couple hundred years ago, eugenic societies were quite popular. So in Sweden, in Scandinavian countries, in America, you had sort of eugenics clubs where you would have the perfect eugenics families. And on the back of that, you have what became the Nazi Holocaust, which was the sort of culmination of years and years of thinking that there was a certain set of groups who were more superior than the rest of the world and all these populations. And some of those ideas are not going to disappear straight away. And we know when we look at far-right groups, the idea of the manosphere on the internet, it's about heritage, it's about blood, it's making America great again, it's about making Europe great again. And this appeals to a lot of young people who feel somewhat lost in this globalization, neoliberal space where what was traditional isn't traditional anymore. And because of the restructuring of the economy, for example, away from industry, away from engineering to the service sector, a lot of men are indigenous men, so Dutch-born men, German-born men, British, English-born men feel disillusioned about their future. They're worried about who they are, what their nation represents. And so it leads to their kinds of extremism. And their kinds of extremism which are, incidentally, and not surprisingly, in opposition to this idea of minorities somehow coming to our country and invading our spaces, taking over our cities, introducing Sharia, etc. But these are all constructions. We know that the self, we know that the other is a construction, but the self is also a construction. And this is all being played out in the light of these problems of globalization. Now, what is the problem of globalization? Globalization, if you're on the right of the spectrum, if you read The Economist, globalization is great. It means the opportunities for business, enterprise, and trade. But at what cost? A tremendous cost offered to those societies bearing those industries. If you look at your iPhone, some people have iPhones, made in China by people who are worked to the bone, prevented from committing suicide, they have no union protection, their wages are stagnated, and they have these nets outside the windows to stop people committing suicide. Your iPhones are made in China, and the profits go to California, entirely to California, and the issues of taxation is another question in terms of Apple, Amazon, some of the biggest players, the biggest corporates, and it's not Ford or General Motors, it's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's Google. These are the biggest corporations on the planet, and more powerful than we can possibly imagine. And if we think about power of the social media, we all know what's been happening. If you've been following this story in the UK about whether Brexit was fixed or not, or if that's linked to Trump and whether that was fixed or not. And these are ongoing issues. Some parts of the establishment want to put all the attention onto Russia, whereas a critique of that would suggest that in fact it's the establishment itself that is behind a lot of these issues. So I'm drifting into the sphere of geopolitics, but what I'm trying to emphasize here that what goes on in these particular local communities is not simply about what's happening in those local communities. Yes, there's the economic space and the problems of the housing market and the fact that it's almost impossible to buy a house in London, even if you are super middle class and you have very stable incomes, because of these extremely huge wealth inequalities that are now the norm in the Western European imagination, particularly in places like London. And particularly when Britain has decided to leave the EU, which is a complete disaster in my view, but Some would argue that it was a close decision. It's very debatable as to what was really behind it and whether any of it stacks up to anything logical or reasonable. But nevertheless, this is a train that is in motion, and the implications are that Britain will now want to trade not with the EU as its main partner, but with China and India and America, which could be disastrous because the perfect system at the moment is the EU system in terms of its ability to trade maximally. But the idea of American foods on our supermarkets is a shocking possibility, and it will lead to all sorts of other costs that only individual citizens will have to bear as part of their attempts to try and travel into Europe, attempts to try and buy European goods and services. So we have this dynamic around the British Muslim community, numbering now 5% of the population, 3 million. It was approximately 1.5 million in 2001. And in the 1951 census, being able to break down the data, it was about 51,000 people. So you can see a general increase in the Muslim population relative to the majority populations. And this is something of a worry to places like Portugal, Spain, France, where the rate of reproduction is declining. So there are huge issues for immigration in those countries. Immigration is a necessity. You cannot survive in these countries. There will be no pension pots for the future if France and Germany and certainly places like Portugal and Spain don't introduce a kind of immigration system that will allow people to come into the country with their skill sets, work in the labour market, pay taxes, shore up the welfare state. But the debate has been hijacked again by different elements of the right, and the mainstream right and the far right, which suggest that immigration is unwarranted, undesirable, unnecessary. And further than that, it is hostile to our values. The word values is conjured up as a way to defend something that's uniquely about that country, about that space. And then the new dilemma, in the light of the events of 9/11, is the idea of security, the securitization of differences. In the 50s and 60s, race was still a popular concept. We moved to ethnicity, and we moved further then still to religion as the marker of difference. You and I are no longer seen as same or different on terms to do with our culture, with our heritage, with our education even. But our religion is seen as the greatest marker of difference, which is completely ridiculous, of course, given that the religions of certainly the Abrahamic traditions have similar roots. But because of the politicization of these identities and identity politics, they've become the marker of difference that divides groups. And again, it's something that creates hostility on what become different sides as a result of these debates. So the Muslims in these inner city areas that I've described in terms of historical process were not Muslims necessarily. They were Asians. They were, up to a point, politically black before becoming politically Asian. But if you're Asian, in Asia, you can start from Turkey all the way to Indonesia. It's a huge space, Asia. And Asia itself is also one of these colonial constructions. But because of this idea of identity becoming more important in these spaces, Asian became South Asian, and South Asian became the different ethnic categories, the Pakistani, Indian, and Bangladeshi. But superseding all of that, religion has become an identifier for these groups from the inside and the outside. And so we see this notion of sometimes folks who arrived in the 50s and 60s tending towards religion during their later years. I mean, I think that's part of life anyway. Most people start to become conservative and spiritual once you get to a certain age because of the idea of morbidity and one's experience of the world leads to a sense of a connectivity to something that's greater than oneself. But what's also happening is that the second generation, so you would expect a certain kind of adaptation among second generations. The children of the immigrants who are born in their countries, such as France and Germany, Spain and Britain, you would expect them to be British, French, and going to the British schools and watching British television and going to the cinema to watch movies in English and reading English comic books and so on. And so all of that experience goes on. and it's part of who they are, but they don't feel British or English. It's partly to do with the categories itself. To be British is to be one of a nation of immigrants. Britain has always had immigration. The Angles, the Saxons, the Vikings, the Jutes, the Eastern European Jews who came 130 years ago fleeing persecution, and then the post-war groups who came because of the post-war Reconstruction process. But there's a certain element of Englishness that sees itself as very distinctly unique. And that kind of ethnic nationalism comes in waves, and at the moment there is a particular degree of ethnic nationalism supported by the political parties such as UKIP, and also because of the main parties swinging to the right in order to hold on to that vote. People who feel threatened by differences, people who feel threatened by immigration, and they see that the conflicts in other parts of the world becoming conflicts in their own countries, and therefore there isn't a direct association between these two realms. But if we look at the DNA analysis of English people, 40% have effectively French blood, which is unsurprising given the conflicts between France and England and the exchange, if you like. And the Norman invasion of 1066 was literally an invasion of the genetic kind too. So I think it's important to remember that all of these kinds of identities are fabrications to a greater or lesser. And this is why Benedict Anderson and the Imagined Communities literature is very important, the sort of founding father of international relations. And it's significant in the context of these communities locked away in these inner city areas who are still facing the general problem of economic decline, who are finding that their second generations are retreating to Islam, not to Englishness or Europeanness, even if they would want to, because theirs is a response to hostility, ongoing patterns of discrimination, ongoing forces of exclusion and alienation that make people want to retreat to something that is much more secure to them, to something that they feel much more confident in the light of all these other spaces breaking down. And with this where Islamophobia then starts to become the idea of the fear of Islam, but it's also the idea of discrimination. Every day you will hear stories about, well, you won't hear it, but they exist, and I hear about them because I'm tapped into these networks, of women who are afraid to go out onto the tube platform wearing a headscarf in case they get pushed. And this happens far too regularly. There are acid attacks in London, motorcycle squads, if you like, who attack people because of their visible differences. Mosques are targeted with hate literature, with swastikas, pigs' heads left behind. There are bomb plots to destroy institutions that Muslims follow, adhere to. And while we talk about Islamist extremism and violence and terrorism, the issue of far-right extremism and terrorism doesn't always get the same press. But there were at least 5 plots last year that were stopped by the security intelligence services before they were about to occur from the far right. But there were also instances when they didn't stop them. You may recall in 2016 the murder of Joe Cox. Joe Cox MP was brutally shot in the middle of the day by a chap from Britain First, who repeatedly stabbed her, and then when he walked away, realized that she wasn't dead, came back and shot her twice in the face. And this was a woman. Okay, so far right is a manosphere. It's about men reclaiming something that's lost, or targeting women. And this was a woman who spoke out about the refugee crisis. She was in favor of the EU, in EU integration, and she spoke passionately about supporting Syrians, Syrian children in particular. Whereas, while Germany was able to take 1 million people in 2015, Britain couldn't decide if they wanted 5,000 children. So it was a very charged, a very heated time, and then at the top of all of that, the Brexit campaign. The Brexit campaign, which is this sort of EU referendum vote, talked about the idea of immigration being a problem, that there are security issues to consider, and that Europe, the European framework is not what Britain needs or wants. In spite of the fact that you have 40 years of tight integration, thousands of pieces of legislation, huge benefits to the citizenry, to trade, to commerce. But it was a very charged and very divisive election campaign, because Britain at that point was already deeply divided on the back of the problems of the 2008 financial crisis, where the banks basically corrupted the system. And so who paid for this? Not the banks. None of the bankers got prosecuted, jailed. I think Iceland was the only example. And there's one guy from Merrill Lynch, happened to be Muslim actually, who got sentenced. But all the others got away with it completely. And the government, led by the financial package that the British decided to re-establish the banks through quantitative easing. That meant printing money and building up the reserves and cutting public services. Austerity, they called it. Now we have this huge problem of knife crime in Britain. I think there's been about 52 people dead this year already because of knife crime. And the reason is there are 10,000 police officers less on the streets. So when the Home Secretary speaks into Parliament, says it's got nothing to do with cuts, and the next day the Home Office, which is the ministry responsible, says actually it's got something to do with cuts. You know that the government is completely out of touch, not just with the rest of the country, but with its own institutions. That's just about the failings of government. I'm just still painting this picture of Muslims in these areas who are locked out. Of course there's a middle class, there's a social mobility, there are people with education and cosmopolitanism and bohemianism who are travellers, who are integrated, and you can see opportunities even in the halal economic sector. So weddings and cake businesses and so on, catering to a kind of halal market, which is growing. Even in Dolce & Gabbana will have headscarves because there is money to be made. But there are 50% of Muslims live in 20% of the poorest areas in the country. Okay? So these areas have low quality services of education, of health, of housing. There are high unemployment rates. There are huge health inequalities. And no surprise is that the poorest Muslims in the country are living next door to the poorest English folk. The English folk who had the jobs in the factories, but are also now suffering because those jobs have disappeared. They're in China. Or even Twinings Tea, which is this brand of tea, now packages its tea in Poland. Okay? And most of the tea is from India and Sri Lanka. That's always been the case. But there's no factory left in England. So these kinds of sectors are declining and further and further. And so manufacturing and industry is affecting not just the Muslim minorities who came to these jobs, but also the English folk. And so they are angry, they're bitter, and they live next door to these Muslim communities. But they don't share the same spaces. The kids don't go to the same schools. What jobs do remain, they don't work in each other's industries. And so they live very divided communities. And these walls, if you like, are very intensely designed, intensely enhanced because of the politics of identity on each side of these walls. They're microcosms of much bigger debates elsewhere in the world. Post-war on terror, 9/11 space in which there have been at least 7 wars on Muslim countries since then. Saudi Arabia potentially is behind the global spread of Wahhabist thinking, which is behind a lot of the radicalization of Sunni Muslims. And yet they're completely absolved from a lot of this focus. And yet places like Afghanistan and Iraq, Syria, Libya have been sort of targeted by this post-war on terror. It's not quite post, it's still going on. It started in November 2001 and it is still going on with Libya, the latest place to destabilize. So you see the global issues around East versus West, Islam versus Christianity, the war on terror, the discourse of globalization and neoliberalism is affecting what's happening in these local communities, largely also because the nation has become more inward-looking in terms of how it sees itself. There was a time in the 70s and 80s when multiculturalism was seen as an opportunity to celebrate differences, to bring together different communities under one umbrella, unity within diversity, diversity within unity, where we could all have this idea of being British, for example, or being Indonesian or Canadian, and celebrating those, that idea of who we are, and respecting the fact that we're all uniquely different, which makes us very interesting, and therefore an opportunity. But all of that has been reversed and put on its head. So now these differences are now seen as a threat to who we are, a threat to our existence, our values, and to our very nation, through the ideas of security. The government would talk to minority communities about their needs, about their wants, about their hopes, about how their needs would be incorporated by the state through various policies, and that in return these communities would be good citizens, taxpayers, loyal, respectful, tolerant, law-abiding, for example, which is perfectly acceptable, sort of a contract of sorts. But now the government only wants to talk to the Muslim communities about security, about de-radicalization, about terrorism, about what to do with mosques, which might be seen as providing messages to their flock, which might be seen as radical. Not about development needs, about the needs of women, and English language training, for example, or youth education programs. It is no surprise that if you have poor schools in these poor areas, they're not designed to create the future doctors and lawyers and the leaders of the country. That they are in what is known, ironically, as public schools, which are in fact private schools, some of which are 500-600 years old. Eton, Westminster, St. Paul's Girls' School, for example, and it is those schools which then send the sort of graduates of those schools into the elite universities. So 7% of all the schools in England, in Britain, rather, are what is called private schools. Sorry, public schools, but they are private schools. But 42% of the intake of Oxbridge are from these private schools. So 93% of the country is in the comprehensive school sector, yet they make up 15% of Oxbridge. So you see there's this huge disproportionality, and there's this sort of network re-establishes itself in the institutions of Whitehall, in government, in media, in the judiciary, for example, and in politics. There was a time when, in David Cameron's cabinet, not only were these men, mostly men, were from the same university, they were from the same school, Eton, Oxford. So you see that there's been this huge problem of elitism and cronyism and this sort of establishment tyrannism that still is in place there, what we call the old boy network. And it's powerful, it's omnipotent, even though globalization is impacting, certainly in the financial sector. If you are a very clever person from any part of Africa or Asia, and you get top marks and you're very good at mathematics or engineering, you can work in a city company making money for the big banks. They wouldn't discriminate, because these are opportunities to make huge profits. But if you are extremely well qualified and you would like to take part in institutions of, say, the Foreign Office or the Ministry of Defence or certain institutions within that, it's very much an elitist, self-selecting group of white men from Oxbridge. And that's not representative of society as a whole. It's representative of the elitism of these institutions. So huge divisions in local area settings, which are leading to these problems of educational underachievement of men, not women. Women are outperforming men in education. I think that's everywhere in the world now. This has been for the last 20 years, even though the salaries are only now being sort of questioned in detail. And this is no less the case in terms of the Muslim experience, South Asian Muslims, Pakistani, Bangladeshis. Indian girls, young women, are outperforming the boys. So these boys are now having to compete even more for the jobs which are not in industry or engineering, but in the service sector, globally, but also with women. And so this underachievement is leading to people falling out of the education into criminality. And criminality is one route into extremism and radicalization. And so this is the connection I want to draw now to the other side of the debate, which is radicalization. So what is this radicalization? This radicalization of, so let's just summarize on Islamophobia. It's institutional, it's cultural, it's structural, it's ideological, and it's built on historical issues of colonialism, xenophobia, and hostility to immigration. So all of these issues are compounded in this dynamic of Islamophobia. It's not one thing, it's many things. And it's all it's happening simultaneously in relation to groups who are Muslims in terms of their self-selected identity, but also the projected identity that's given onto these others by majority societies. And suddenly, you're not Asian anymore, you're now Muslim. And so when Muslim men are sort of put in this pressure, they will start growing the beard or putting a headscarf on and writing sort of Arabic on their t-shirts and kind of cool, urban cool, but it's a mixture of different kinds of identities. So there is that. And then let's flip over to the other side, and we have this notion of radicalization. What are these problems here? This problem of terrorism and extremism and the need to counter it through countering violent extremism. CVE, you may have heard of if you're into this field. It's this global phenomenon that has been introduced by the UN, UN Action Plan in September 2015. The nations are now have to introduce national action plans. They have to identify a set of policies that actively de-radicalize Muslims, predominantly focused on Muslims, although recently the far right have been tacked on from afterthought. The problem here then is that what is clearly a problem of terrorism, what is a terror attack? The attack itself is the terrorism. It's the act that makes it a terror. And so when these guys want to blow themselves up and make a big hoo-ha, it's the response that they want, which is the terrorism that they seek. What's driving them is political, ideological. It's no surprise that a lot of these guys have mental health problems, history of criminality, drug abuse, violence towards women is a significant pattern that keeps coming up again and again for far-right guys as well as these Islamist guys. But the discourse, the dominant discourse in terms of radicalization is that there is a problem with how these guys are interpreting, buying into, incorporating ideas that are Islamic in nature. Now there are plenty of scholars who would talk about political Islam, the politicization of Islam, the way in which Islam radicalizes young men, that the problem is Islamic radicalism, etc. And there's a huge industry around that. People whose careers were fading around 9/11 suddenly became experts on Islam. And the problem with that is that it does not take into consideration all of the years of colonialism, the ways in which the Western powers went about trying to destabilize societies. For example, India, Pakistan, they're almost designed by the English colonial experience to make sure that there's an enmity between Islam and Hinduism. The enmity between these two groups, which was under the rubric of Greater India, as a kind of fluid dynamic. We have Qawwali music, which is Sufi Islamic leanings with Hindu musical traditions. Okay, we have even Sikhism emerging from the intersection of conservative Islam and the idea of kind of repelling against some of the elitism of Hinduism, the caste system, for example. Okay, so the fluid nature of communities and religions coming together gave us this India. But when the British came, they started to divide and rule. Divide and rule is a system that the English learned themselves, having been once divided and ruled by the Romans, which is what the Romans did. The Romans were the chief architects of divide and rule. This is how it became the empire it did. So this divide and rule has led to these notions of nations that are artificial and are in conflict with each other. And when it comes to this idea of radicalization, the general dominant discourse on the part of governments across Western Europe, in the EU and different states within that, is that somehow we need to do something to moderate Islam or Muslims, to moderate the institutions, to try and de-radicalize from within. There is zero active consideration of foreign policy, and also failed domestic policy and integration. That seems to be sort of brushed aside, where the remaining focus is entirely on the idea that if we fix Islam, or fix this group's particular moderated version of Islam, then we have the solutions to terrorism. It takes it away from all of the geopolitical concerns and the historical paradigms that are involved in determining terrorism. And we see terrorism from examples here. The most closest probably is Turkey with PKK. PKK was stateless. They were left out of the redesign of Turkey after the War of Independence. And they were persecuted by the state, bombed for wanting to keep their language, their names, their villages intact. The PKK's first targets were its own elites for being basically subservient to Ankara. So there are some Marxist-Leninist leanings were its starting points. And then once the war effectively started, it targeted the Turkish military. FARC in Colombia were also a group who were wanting rights, recognition of their ethnic group identities that were denied to them. The ETA in Spain, which is this sort of aggression around the need for their own heritage, language, identity to provide some recognition by the state, but the state of Spain doesn't want to do that, so it enforces a system that is undesirable, and it leads to tension, which are genuine political concerns, and it turns them into politics of resistance, ultimately leading to terrorism. You see, all of that is then completely discarded in the context of this Islamophobic space, where the idea of moderating the religion, de-radicalizing Muslims, and creating a sense of a security zone around the Muslim experience, rather than an integration zone or a cultural interaction zone, it's become the dominant discourse. And so this is the problem of the way in which radicalization is conceived of, and the policy of de-radicalization in its current shape. In this sort of design and the delivery of policies by governments, you do get obviously British-born Muslims who feel that they're part of this process and are active agents almost. I mean, they're instruments of the designs of the state, and they're perfectly happy to go along with it because it's a secure environment. But anybody who's critical of the space is seen as a threat. For example, my left-leaning academic colleagues will talk about elitism, will talk about Islamophobia, and they will get lots of attention. But if I do it, it's like, oh my goodness, this guy, can we really trust him? Is he one of them, or is he one of us? Such is the nature of the way the debate is polarized around these sharp markers of them and us and them, inside and outside. So radicalization is in part a complete construction of the state. To be radical is to be resistant. There's nothing wrong with radicalization in the sense of its role without the need for violence. In the 1960s, there was a generation of radicalism on campuses. We had the civil rights movement in America, we had the '68 movement in anti-Vietnam War movement in Paris, in London. All the intellectuals that we see now in sociology professors, they're all 68ers. They're still around, they're going to go soon, but the baby boomers. And in many ways, if you want to be really critical, they've let us all down. The golden opportunity they had in terms of post-war reconstruction has led to where we are in the world today, which is a configuration of the failings of men, which is another thesis of mine, it's not very popular. And the idea is that a golden chance has been squandered. We are war divided, war unequal, the planet is more unhealthier than ever, and there is no imagination left. There's no idea of what's around the corner that we can adequately plan for the most part, although there are pockets of resistance and there's always hope. So the radicalization industry is definitely something that is created out of the center. It's created for a purpose to modify Muslims, and for Muslims who want to resist, who feel beleaguered by racism, by discrimination, who are angry about these foreign wars, who feel that there's a sense of purpose in standing together with others, are now seen as a security threat, are now seen as a worry for the state. And this is conflating the problems of Muslim identity politics with the radicalization industry. And radicalizers, so the people who do get radicalized are radicalized by radicalizers. What do they use? They use the language of Islamophobia. The online tweets, Twitter, which was really the most useful tool of Islamic State, used the discourse of, well, the West doesn't want you. It doesn't want Islam. The West is on a constant war with Islam. Come join the perfect utopian society that is Iraq and Syria, Islamic State, Daesh, ISIL. We will give you a job. We will give you abundance of nature. We will even find you a wife. And if you can speak French and Arabic and English, will even give you a greater salary, will pay you in dollars. And you can even have PlayStation and Snicker bars, because these things were available too. So this sort of a utopian, dystopian society was presented as this perfect space for these angry, beleaguered, upset, lost, vulnerable, mentally unstable young men looking for something to hold on to, because their self had been annihilated by the other, and they were facing all sorts of pressures of self-esteem, of purpose, self-realization and self-actualization. And it's the same thing we see among the far right, who are also looking for an identity. And the internet is a huge, huge space in which these kind of identity formations form out. The manosphere, men who are resistant to the idea of women, to the idea of homosexual marriages that's been legalized in various parts of the world now, Western world. They are anti-feminism movement. They see that it's counterproductive, or that it's definitely left them out of the game. And they see that the immigrants and the others are also a problem, and they want to take their country back. They want to make America great again. It's no surprise that the language that Trump uses is the language of the far right, because he's appealing to a population that is the angriest, that is the most disaffected, that feels what Britain are called the left behind. The left behind, angry, dispossessed, feeling that they have no role and no stake. And so in that realm, everybody's to blame, and their most visible other neighbours are the most to blame. And yet they're still deeply loyal to the state, to the monarchy, in the case of Britain. And so we have this sort of Islamophobic space at the sort of discourse level at the top. We have the Muslims in the inner city areas who are angry, and then we have the far right who are also affected by Islamophobic, the wider discourse of Islamophobia, but their hostility is also shaped by their local era experiences in these urban settings, which is then therefore a connection of the local, the national, and the geopolitical, affecting both the Islamized, radicalized young Muslim men, but also this kind of manosphere connected far right guys. Andras Breivik, his biggest anger was towards multiculturalism, the idea that Norway had become diluted, and he alluded to far right Nazi symbolism. He even got plastic surgery to make his face look even more Aryan. And he was obsessed. And also, what was he? He was a loner. He probably had Asperger's or ADHD, and he played a lot of the violent games, online games, PlayStation 4, etc. Boys play a lot of these games. They're extremely violent. This also plays onto the jihadi guys who can then take their Call of Duty, literally in Iraq and Syria, get an AK-47 or an M16, and turn into reality what they've been doing for hours and hours on end in their lonely, closed-door spaces, shut off from their households, from their neighborhoods, from their urban areas, from their cities, from the nation. So these are the kinds of things I'm interested in, and a lot of these things are sort of discussed in the book, where I also talk about media. Now, media is has always been a problem for Islamophobia. Fundamentalism was first used in relation to the Iranian Revolution in The Observer in 1980. Clash of Civilizations was talked about in the late 1980s. And it's a completely dodgy concept, but it took hold very quickly. And then it becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy. And with the internet, it's now possible to use bots, fake IDs, fake news, and there are some theories at the moment that there's quite an element of the far right which is activated online that sort of forces these retweets which are Islamophobic. So, for example, if there's an attack. For example, there was one in Munster in Germany a few days ago. Now, at first it was Islamic, radical. He shouted Allah Akbar. Okay, he left a letter. These were all the tweets that were flying out, but these are all fake. It didn't happen. In fact, I think it was a far-right guy, and so it's a far-right guy. It completely disappears off the news. Nobody wants to know. It didn't happen. And so this is the kind of inequity that we're dealing with in terms of the representation in media. So media is also a focus. The policy of countering violent extremism, de-radicalization is a focus. The question of national identity, and the issue of geopolitics, and what this all means. And in terms of what this all means as a conclusion, what I suggest in the book is that for many Muslims who are stuck in this sort of space of here and there and here and nowhere, is that they have to work, in spite of all of the problems. In fact, there is still a huge problem of distrust of the state, that Muslims have to work even harder to demonstrate that there is something to be had by their contribution to society, and that is not all negative, and that of course there are going to be internal differences, and that they need to be set aside for the greater good. Now, it's all sort of shiny, happy world in the end. Of course, a book always needs a conclusion, because otherwise it's just full of a lot of bad news. And just to conclude here, there is a lot of bad news out there. And it's very difficult to try and see good news in all of this. We have huge problems structurally, culturally, institutionally, politically, ideologically, and they're being played out on a daily basis to the extent that we have this hyper-normalization. Islamophobia has become normal. It's okay. You might even say something to each other having a coffee break and think, 5 years ago I might have been Islamophobic, but I'm just saying it now without thinking about it. And there's this problem of radicalization. It is also becoming almost hyper-normal. There were 5 major terrorist attacks in Britain last year alone. At least 10 were thwarted, far-right and Islamist. There were attacks in Germany, in Munich, Alicembly. There were attacks in France regularly from Bataclan, rock concert onwards. There's lots of theories. Are these false flags? Is there something else going on? It's unclear. There's so much we cannot really know. What we can know is that we can analyze policy, we can see the result of these policies in terms of perceptions, and we can look at urban areas and look at communities in context and work at what's happening in terms of identities and conflicts, and try to understand these things in a greater picture. I think I'll end there. Thank you for your attention. Sorry if some of these thoughts were a bit rambling. There's a lot going on, a lot to think about. We have about half an hour. I'd be very keen to hear your questions, thoughts, quibbles, giggles. The floor is yours.